Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Markus Faltermeier, and I'm working for the Bavarian Center for Transatlantic Relations, the Stiftung Bayerisches Amerikahaus here in Munich. I have the honor of hosting tonight's event, where we look at the role of the American working class in the recent presidential elections. Before we jump right in, let me thank our co-organizers of this panel discussion, the BayernForum of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, as well as the DGB Munich, the German Trade Union Confederation, the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund. Thanks for making this possible. It's my honor to work with you on this. In the year 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost the presidential elections against Donald Trump, a lot of journalists, as well as analysts, at least partly blamed the so-called working class, which was supposed to be closer to the Democrats, but supported Donald Trump in that election. While this assessment was already problematic for the 2016 election, given the vast diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, and other identity-related issues within what might be described as the so-called working class, and which of course also had ramifications for the question which presidential ticket was supported, it is nonetheless important that we also in 2020 look at how people from a working class background voted this year. I am very proud that we have such a prolific panel for this discussion tonight. Before I'll introduce our experts, let me quickly inform you that we are very sorry that one of the announced speakers, Bill SPRIGGS, from Howard University and Chief-Economist of AFL-CIO, cannot be with us tonight due to his involvement in Joe Biden's transition team. And of course, as you can tell, there are some things that are at least a little bit more important than our talk tonight. This does, however, not take away anything from the excellency of our panel tonight. So after my short intro, we will hear two statements from our experts before we move on to a Q&A, where your questions will be heard. You have the option of using our Q&A tool within Zoom. You'll find it below in the menu on the F&A button to ask questions, or you can post your question on the live stream at YouTube if you follow this event on YouTube. Your third option would be to send us an email to event@amerikahaus.de. That's Amerikahaus in the German form, so with a K and an H and an AU, .de with your question. So let me now introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Ms. Anja WEHLER-SCHÖCK. She is counselor at the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., and currently serves there as counselor for the portfolios on labor, health, and drug policy, as well as on social affairs and gender policy. Before that, she headed the Amman office of the German Friedrich-Ebert Foundation and was responsible for the organization's work in Jordan and Iraq. In this, her focus was on promoting democracy and social justice, with activities covering a broad spectrum ranging from parliamentary consultations to youth projects and the special line of work dedicated to the political Islam. Prior to joining the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, her task led her to Tunisia, to Jordan, and the United States. She authored several German and English language publications, including a book on women's rights in Jordan, and has a number of other articles out there on political developments in the Middle East and so on. So welcome, Ms. WEHLER-SCHÖCK. I'm glad that you're here with us tonight. Our second speaker is Professor Sherry LINKON. She is professor of English at Georgetown University at the American Studies Institute, or the American Studies Department there, and she's involved as faculty in the Kamenowitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. And I actually got to know her through her involvement with the so-called Center for Working Class Studies at Youngstown State University in the center of Ohio, basically, where she also directed the American Studies program, and she was director of the mentioned Center for Working Class Studies there. Her work, although she's a very prolific writer and she wrote on a lot of different things, I think one of the central issues in her work is the working class, and she has written a number of books on the topic. For example, her most recent book, The Half-Life of Deindustrialization, working class writing about economic restructuring, which appeared in Michigan in 2018, and which examines contemporary American working class literature and media. She has written with John Russo, the other director at the Working Class Studies Center in Youngstown, Steeltown, USA, Work and Memory in Youngstown, and co-edited with him the New Working Class Studies Journal. So I'm really glad that she's here with us tonight, that both of you are here with us tonight, and I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion on that. The way we're going to have it today is I will ask Anja and Sherry a couple of questions before we open the floor for the discussion, and but there will be enough time for you to raise your questions and have your questions answered during this talk. So let me start with you, Anja. Welcome again. Thanks for being with us tonight. When we talk about the working class, we often associate it with labor unions. And in this election, Joe Biden was very adamant in his attempt to cater to unions, especially in Michigan and elsewhere as well, especially in those areas around the Rust Belt. So maybe you can provide us with some context in terms of the role of unions in the election processes in the United States, their political engagement in the US, and maybe you can even compare it a little bit to Germany so we get a feel for what labor unions do in relation to the working class and to the political life in the US. So welcome again, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me. And it's an excellent question. And the title of our discussion mentions the blue-collar vote, and I think Sherry will go more into detail on terminology. But since blue-collar vote and union vote are often used in the same context, I thought it might be helpful at the outset of our discussion to provide a little bit of context on the role that unions play in the US and how the US and Germany differ when it comes to labor relations and related questions. But I don't want to imply that the blue-collar vote and union vote are to be seen as synonymous, which is by no means the case. And as you mentioned, both President-elect Biden and President Trump heavily courted the union vote in the 2020 election. And you might ask why. The rate of organization in the US has been steadily declining, and now the rate of organization is only at 10.7%. But in the US, unions play a significant role in elections. And in some aspects, this is quite different than it is in Germany. Firstly, and maybe most strikingly for a German audience, because it's a clear contrast to the German model, unions are very big donors in elections. And in the US, running a campaign is much more costly than in Germany. And candidates have to focus a lot on fundraising. So the individual unions, as well as the federations, regularly give millions of dollars to the Democratic Party and to Democratic candidates. And this is, of course, quite a contentious issue, because not all union members are Democrats, and not all agree with unions using their funds to support Democrats. And there have even been a number of lawsuits, and spending has been limited. But funding is still a significant part. And then when you look at it at a political level, there's currently a pretty clean split between Democrats and Republicans on the issue of unions. Democrats are usually supportive of a bigger role for unions, and Republicans are against it. It didn't always used to be that case in the US, at least not as clear-cut as it is now, but labor relations have become more and more partisan since the 80s, basically. And we've seen very recently an initiative from some Republicans to reach out again to unions, to offer some cooperation between Republicans and unions. But so far, it's very partisan. But coming back to the role that unions play in the election, even more important than their financial contributions is their role in mobilizing their members. union members are among the groups with the highest voter turnout, which is extremely important when you look at how low voter turnout has been in some of the past US elections. And in this election, it was even more important because unions are especially strong in some of the battleground states for this election, like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so this is one of the reasons why both candidates had a strong interest in courting unions. Unions are traditionally heavily involved in campaigning. You'll see labor leaders participate in candidates' campaigns. And most unions also give endorsements to candidates and to the presidential candidate. And when you look back, Trump in 2016 and in 2020 tried to present himself as an advocate for the working class, but he did not deliver on his promises. On the contrary, labor rights and union activity were significantly reduced under his administration. And Joe Biden presented himself as a union man and a working class kid from Scranton. And during his campaign, he presented a clear agenda on what he would do to strengthen labor rights and unions under his presidency. And the vast majority of unions endorsed Joe Biden, many more even that had endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016. But this also shows the discrepancy between the union leadership, which mostly leans Democratic, and union members, where a considerable share is Republican. And you could see that when unions issued endorsements for Joe Biden, some members would publicly renounce this endorsement and vouch their support for Trump. And when you look at Trump, it was interesting because in 2016, only 2 unions had endorsed him. And now in 2020, he was able to win the endorsement of 23 unions, and most of them representing police and security staff, which of course ties into the debate that went on in the last few months here around police brutality and also initiatives to defund the police. So it came as a little surprise that these unions vouched their support to Trump. I'll stop here with this brief introduction and let Sherry chime in and come back later. Thank you.
So thank you, Anja, for your first little input. And again, if anybody in the audience has questions on Anja's statements, feel free to use the Q&A tool in Zoom or write a comment on the YouTube page of this event or send us an email to event@amerikahaus.de, and we'll make sure that your questions reach our experts. So Sherry, your work revolves around the topic of the American working class, as I have mentioned before. And I mean, I'm not sure, but I would suggest that the working class in the US is not a very coherent group of people sharing a coherent milieu. This is something that we in Germany oftentimes think of, like we have a very specific set of persons in mind when we talk of the working class. And that's not even true. This image is not even true for Germany, but it's a little more homogeneous in Germany than it is in the United States, I believe. So maybe you can provide us some insights to what we are actually talking about when we speak of the working class in the US. And maybe you can also provide a short analysis of the elections, the recent elections, and the working class vote. So welcome, Sherry. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. As you suggest at the end, these are big questions. Let me try to cover a lot of material fairly quickly, but as clearly as I can. And I think it's actually helpful to start with the image that I think most people have when they think of working class in the United States and all over the place, which is a white man in a hard hat who works in an auto plant. But that's not true for the working class as a whole anymore. It's not even true when we talk about union households. So in the United States, historically, unions have been what blue-collar workers belong to. But these days, the union movement, not only is it small, as Anja notes, it's primarily not industrial workers anymore. It's school teachers, it's police officers, and a very significant portion are government workers. So lots of people working in offices, people working in food service. So even within unions, it's a much more diverse group. So a few things to think about as we try to capture the diversity of the working class, which will help us understand why we can't talk about the way the working class voted. We have to say that the working class, more of the working class went for Trump this time, and more of the working class went for Biden. And in order to make any sense of that, we've got to understand how big and crazy it is. So it's helpful to start with the idea that scholars who study class say that about 60% of Americans belong to the working class. And they make that distinction based largely on occupation and the nature of jobs, how much power and autonomy people have in their jobs, what kind of work they actually do in their jobs. Survey data within the United States has been asking Americans for the last 50 years, what class do you belong to? Given 4 options, lower class, working class, middle class, and upper class, consistently across those 50 years, somewhere around 45% of Americans identify themselves as working class. So if we take those 2 figures, whether it's 60% or 45%, the working class is huge. I mean, that's millions and millions of people. So of course, they're not all the same. About 40% of that group is not white. So only about 60% of the working class is white, even though our standard image is this white guy in the hard hat. Only about 13% of Americans now work in manufacturing of any kind. Most do work in the service industries, but service work is a huge category. It covers everything from clerical staff to home healthcare workers to truck drivers and cashiers and janitors, and we could go on and on. It also includes a lot of people working part-time, contingent jobs, the gig economy, the underground economy, a really, really wide range of things. The working class today includes people who have some college education, including some people who have 4-year college degrees, as well as people who barely graduated high school, and some people who didn't even get that. It also includes people who live everywhere, big cities, small towns, suburbs, rural areas. So it's just such a big catch-all. To be able to talk about it at all, we have to narrow things down a little bit. That doesn't stop pollsters, however, from trying to talk about the working class. And it doesn't stop people like me and lots of pundits from trying to talk about how working class people vote. So both preliminary and exit polls try to identify working class voters through a combination of income and education. So they break it down by percentiles of income. They don't necessarily call it working class. They just note what percentage of American voters who voted in which way make less than $50,000 a year or less than $100,000 a year. And I would say that somewhere between those 2 categories is an income level that we can say is nearing the top for working class jobs of all kinds. It's worth noting that in both of those categories, under 50,000 and under 100,000, the majority of those voters still vote Democratic. The majority of those voters went for Joe Biden this time, and actually a majority of those voters went for Hillary Clinton in 2016. They also ask about college degrees, and this is the thing that pollsters most often rely upon as a stand-in for class. About 43% of those surveyed in exit polls did not have college degrees. It's about 64% if you take the US Census data, which suggests that there's a fair amount of people without college degrees who simply didn't vote or are not showing up in one way or another in exit polls. Trump took about half of the votes of those folks, but he declined a little bit among white voters without college, declined among white voters without college degrees. He actually gained a little bit more of voters of color who don't have college degrees, which is surprising to lots of people given all of the discussions about race. So all of that just gives us a sense of how difficult it is to pin down. We could take working class voters by income in particular areas. Most people have not yet done that close of an analysis, but we'd have to get that narrow and specific to really talk about what happened. we can say a few things about what happened in the 2020 election. And let's focus on those Rust Belt states that Marcus mentioned. So Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, together with Georgia, are the states that really made a difference for Joe Biden in this election. Those things changed for several reasons. One is higher voter turnout overall, which means also more people among the working class, but just larger numbers. There were a lot of people who didn't vote in 2016. They either disliked Hillary Clinton or they were so confident that she was going to win that they didn't think they needed to show up. There was increased turnout by voters of color. And while Trump did make some gains among voters of color, overwhelmingly in every category of race other than white, people are more likely to vote Democratic than they are to vote Republican. There are demographic shifts. So states like Pennsylvania gained in the total population of people of color, while a state like Ohio, where I lived for many years, that not only stayed with Donald Trump, but increased its percentage of support for Donald Trump, is getting whiter over time. So as those demographics shift, they matter in those politics. And then finally, there are cultural shifts. A larger portion of the working class is living now in suburbs. Some are living in rural areas and exurbs, but those suburbs are shifting. And as suburbs get higher proportions of people with college degrees, higher proportions of people who are doing reasonably well economically, those areas are more likely to vote Democratic. So that suggests that the parts where they are less likely to have college degrees, the more working class, are shifting more towards Republicans. I'll finish by saying just one more thing, which is that shift of the working class towards the Republican side, especially white working class voters. This is not a new thing. It doesn't go back to 2016. It goes back at least to about 1970. This is a long, slow shift that has happened in part because of economics, in part because of cultural attitudes. We can talk a lot more about all of those things.
Great, Sherry. And I actually, there are already a couple of questions that come to mind on what you just said. But before we enter the Q&A, just let me ask Anja one more question. Anja, let's talk a bit about what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks and months, also for the Biden administration. You already mentioned that Joe Biden very much tried to convince voters from unions to vote from him, but at least some news outlets suggest that actually his attempt wasn't as successful as he had hoped. So what does he need to do in the next couple of weeks to make sure that the voting class understands that his policies might be good for them or maybe not? So what do you expect?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I'd first like to give a quick thought about what you said, that the working class might think that it's good for them. Well, I think in these elections and also in the 2016 elections, we were able to observe that ideology literally trumped interests, because many of the issues that Biden presented and that Hillary Clinton presented would be very much beneficial for members of the working class. For example, extending healthcare benefits, or making sure that more Americans have healthcare coverage, raising the minimum wage, increasing labor protections, all sorts of issues that would be beneficial to those living with a moderate or lower income. But you could see, as Sherry mentioned, that shares of these populations went again for 2016 for Trump in 2016 and again in 2020, and often those families had long traditions of being Democrats. So I think an important observation is that there's an ideological shift among these voters. But as you mentioned, Biden presented a very strong labor rights program during his campaign, and you can already see that he's following up on this. His transition team has many labor representatives and also has many experts coming from a labor rights background. And even when you look at his economic team, which he's partially already chosen, Janet Yellen as head of the Treasury, for example, and the members of his Council of Economic Advisors, and you can see those are people who are looking at issues like unemployment and inequality, and will have in mind when they design economic policies of the Biden administration, what the impact of this pandemic has been for these people, and what also inequality, which has increased in the US over the past decades, means. So I think there is confidence that labor, not only from unions, but also people with labor expertise, will have an increased say, and probably one of the cabinet members, either the labor department or maybe the education department, will come from a union background. I'll stop here and we can come back to that question during the discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Anja. Maybe I'll follow up on something that touches upon what both of you said in your recent statements. You mentioned that there is an ideological and maybe also a cultural shift. And Sherry, you mentioned that it also already started actually in the 1970s when the Democrats basically lost their grip on the traditional blue-collar vote or the working class vote. And that this had something to do with social conservatism, I guess, to a certain degree, that people who come from this background or from this economic background also tend to be more socially conservative than people who are living in metropolitan areas. Although you already mentioned that, of course, the working classes also existed in metropolitan areas. So, but what interested me in this is that oftentimes, when you look at, for example, what Bernie Sanders suggests, and I'm very, I like what he's saying on a lot of things, of course, but he often focuses on these economic issues that we'll have to improve the social, or the Americans need to improve their social security system, that the Americans need to provide better healthcare and so on. So, I mean, these are things that the Germans are very happy with, and we are living very comfortably with it. So, of course, we think that this is a good idea. But then again, it seems that if ideological or like socio-ideological issues play such a big role in deciding who you are going to vote for, then maybe any attempt to cater to these voters must also take into account that economic issues by themselves do not necessarily bring those voters back into your playground, so to speak. So I'd like to hear what your opinion on this is, and if I may add a second question to that, because of course, right after the elections, basically the left wing of the Democratic Party already asked for more involvement in the administration, and also, of course, in the political outlook of the Biden administration, and rightly so, I would say. But I'd like to hear from you, like because there is this big argument going on in the United States whether the Democrats should approach a more leftist orientation, or whether that might actually scare away a lot of people who are socially more conservative. So I think this is a very important topic, and I'd like to hear from you what you have to say to that.
I wish I had a definitive answer on that, because I think it really is up in the air. On the one hand, we know that there were a fair number of people in 2016 who had been Bernie Sanders supporters in the primaries who ended up voting for Donald Trump. And part of what I think that reflects is a long-standing sense of distrust in mainstream politics in the United States, of having seen kind of moderate policies, a lot of the kinds of things that I actually think Joe Biden is going to pursue, not turning out to do a heck of a lot for your average what some people used to call the working class aristocracy. That is the part of the working class that has pretty stable jobs that pay reasonably well, those who are still protected, for example, by strong unions. They are not so sure they want nationalized healthcare because they like the healthcare that their contract negotiations led to. They are not so sure about certain improvements in Social Security, for example, or other kinds of government programs. And in many cases, they feel like they have worked very hard for certain benefits that they now resent the idea that anybody else would just be given. You know, for them, that was the reward for hard work. So for some people like that, even the economics don't look like they're going to help them very much. And they're worried about things like losing their private health insurance. That was a big part of the debate during the Democratic primaries over how far the party should go towards embracing this. At the same time, there's a large portion within the Democratic Party, and I think this includes a lot of working class people, perhaps more the portion of the working class that is in more contingent jobs, service industry jobs that either are not unionized or don't have very strong unions, people who are working in the gig economy, all of these other portions of the economy for whom things like national health care seems like a great idea. It would make a huge difference in their lives. People who are supporting the idea of free college tuition, you know, for whom that seems like an opportunity for them that has not previously been available. All of which is to say, on the economic issues, I think people are really divided. And I think there's underlying that is this sort of core American resistance to anything that feels like too much government taking care of people. Ignoring the fact that, of course, we've had government doing that, at least going back to the beginning of the Social Security Administration, and that we provide lots of government subsidies to corporations. But there is this kind of idea about independence. But I think it's important to remember, too, that there's a large portion of people within the working class, especially white people within the working class, and especially former industrial workers within the working class, who feel like they've been left behind, not only economically, but culturally. They don't feel valued. They don't feel seen, as American dialect goes these days. They don't feel respected. They don't feel like their needs are being taken care of. And those are the kinds of people who talk about the idea that we've lost our country. It's somehow disappeared. That's a tougher group to try to pull back in, because part of their attitude is a general resentment towards and mistrust of government, and a sense that they are just losing their place in society. And, you know, they're not entirely wrong to feel that way. As we become a more diverse society, they are less prominent. And I'm not sure how we deal with that, but I think that's going to be one of the challenges going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's especially interesting because this basically suggests that emotions are actually a very big part in the process of casting your vote. It's not just the rationality, not just economic rationality, not even like ideological rationality, which decides whether you're pro-life or pro-choice or something like that. It's basically more, even though this is of course also an emotional reaction to the question, but it seems, I mean, this seems to make almost sense with the question why Donald Trump, and this is what you, Anja, said before, I think, and maybe you can add to that, that somehow Donald Trump seems to speak the language of at least part of the people who are coming from the voting class, although nothing he ever did or does actually provides any proof that he really wants to make policies for them. At least this is an impression that a lot of people have. So why is he still relatively successful among people that are coming from a working class background? And maybe the emotional part is actually the answer to that, because they can relate to the rhetorics that he's basically providing, and they don't really care about the rationality, the economic rationality that's behind it. And I'm interested to hear if that thesis might there might actually be something to it. So yeah, maybe Anja, you can add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I think you raise a very important point. Before the elections, the New York Times did a very big survey of voters in Pennsylvania that had a long tradition of being Democrats and then turned to Trump in 2016. And what particularly stuck with me was a quote from a man who said, we used to always vote for Democrats because they had our back, but Hillary Clinton in 2016, she made us feel bad. She called us deplorables. And Donald Trump came and he said, I'll make America great again. And he made us feel good. And I think that sort of speaks to the point that you raised, that it's also about rhetoric and emotions. And I think something that the Republican Party did really well in this election was to play towards fears of people. And when you look, for example, at the vote in Florida, I think the specter of socialism that the Republican Party used very well shifted a lot of votes there. And of course, the Democratic agenda is by no means socialist, but there are many people, especially with a migrant background from Latin America, from Cuba, who say, well, if we're about to experience socialism here in the US, no way that we're going to vote for this party. And I also wanted to come back to the divisions that the Democrats are experiencing. And I think this will be something that Joe Biden will be struggling with in his legislature. And the Democratic Party covers an extreme span. If you look, for example, at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the left side, and maybe Hillary Clinton and her peers on a more right side, this is an extreme spectrum that a political party, a single political party, is covering. And this, when you compare it to the German spectrum, these people would all be in different political parties. But this makes it extremely difficult for Democrats to develop a single coherent agenda and to move forward. And of course, when it comes to implementing policies under his administration, it will come down to who wins the two Senate seats in Georgia as well. And at the moment, Georgia is a political battlefield because control of the Senate will determine so much.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions that reached us through Zoom, and I think they fit very well to what we're talking right now. So one question is, Professor Lincoln, you mentioned that the working class shifted to the Republican side. Does the powerful myth of self-sufficiency and the American dream make progressive measures look un-American, or has the left failed the American class?
That's a challenging either or, but I do think that there are lots of Americans for whom the idea of socialized anything feels to them un-American. In ways that belonging to a union and negotiating a contract with tens of thousands of other auto workers, for example, to get your healthcare doesn't. It's not so much about how you get it, it's about the choices that you have within it. There's been a lot of fear-mongering within the US about healthcare in particular, and the idea that if they socialize medicine in any way, people will lose their choices, they'll lose access, we will no longer have the best healthcare in the world, setting aside the fact that we actually don't, but lots of Americans are deeply invested in that sort of American exceptionalism idea. So yeah, I think that's partially tied in to the whole individualism of American culture, the myth of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's partially about a very long-standing American history of differentiating ourselves from Europe in particular in whatever political ways we can, of setting ourselves apart as special and different and better. It's unfortunately true that in many cases, and healthcare in particular, but other aspects of American society as well, we're actually hurting ourselves by doing that. Has the left failed America in not making that case better? I find that harder to say. The left has not had that much power in American politics in a consistent way. It's been really mainstream, center of the road, center left, we call it here, which in many places would be called conservative. Clinton and both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton are good examples of that. So we're just starting to really see a left that is rising. And I'm curious and, you know, in my best moments, hopeful to see what will happen because of all of that. But they are up against some serious obstacles of American culture to make those changes.
Thanks. I mean, the problem is, this is something that just came to mind, that at the same time, the right is also rising to a certain degree. And we witnessed that, of course, as well in Germany. So this is not something that is specific to the United States. But so, yeah, we'll see how it's going to play out. So there's another question which actually really relates well to our topic. Is the left wing of the Democrats the real voice of the working class? So do they actually reflect the needs that the working class has in the United States? If we can speak of a working class, of course.
Well, so my response would be, it depends on which working class you're talking about. It's worth noting that a large portion of the most left members of Congress have been elected from districts that have that are more urban, that have higher proportions of not just people of color, but also immigrants. And so I think they are a little bit closer to what we might at some point imagine as a working class kind of base. At the same time, a lot of the support for those leftist politics are coming from younger college students. So younger voters who are in college, who are studying all of the kinds of things that people like me teach, and, you know, getting radicalized because, you know, we're all these radical professors. You know, they're learning about other ways of thinking about the world. They're learning about ways of thinking about justice, about thinking about structural inequality, and they're pushing back. So that's not the working class wing of the party. You know, the working class of the Democratic Party is really divided. So depends, as always, on what part of the working class you're talking about. Do I think the left should be the voice of the working class? Yes, because I think the left is much more progressive in economic terms. And for all of the differences of the working class, the thing that they share most is economic vulnerability. And they need policies that are going to make them less vulnerable economically. And I think that comes more from the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
Thanks. And then one more question that reached us via email is, what's your opinion on the neoliberal politics of Bill Clinton in the 90s? Do they have a role in losing the working class? And I think this, again, goes out to both of you, so whoever is comfortable to ask something.
Sherry, I would give you the floor to answer that first.
Well, so I would start with a story that John Russo tells all the time. So we were living in Northeastern Ohio John going back to the early 80s. I moved there in the early 90s. And John tells the story about being in the auto plants in the 1990s, sorry, and talking to people about NAFTA. And the idea that workers said, if whatever government officials support NAFTA, we will never support them. And NAFTA is very closely associated with Bill Clinton. If you look at what happened in many American cities, and especially for African-American voters, African-American residents, we saw revisions to welfare that built in work requirements for a lot of people getting welfare and led to a lot of people losing whatever government support they had. We also saw the rise of the war on drugs, which led to mass incarceration, which had a particularly powerful effect on African-American men and on urban neighborhoods dominated by African-Americans. A number of people have speculated, and we don't really know, a number of people have speculated that one of the reasons that Black voter turnout in the US went down in 2016 was because people could not stomach supporting Hillary Clinton because they associated her with the neoliberal policies of her husband. And there were things that she said in the 1990s that came back to haunt her that made a lot of people feel like they simply could not trust her. They'd seen what the center portion of the Democratic Party had done. Even though Joe Biden is just as much in that center, he has stronger working class credentials and he has a much better history with voters of color.
Maybe just to add on, I feel that for union voters, NAFTA played a very big role both in 2016 and then onwards. NAFTA was sort of a rallying point because many union members, many workers felt that the repercussions of NAFTA really hurt them, and Trump promised, and this is actually a promise he kept, that he would renegotiate it. And what we heard during the USMCA, so the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, what we heard is that union leaders felt as integrated into the negotiation process as they had never been before. And very interestingly, USMCA also has much stronger labor controls than NAFTA had. So giving the Department of Labor more rights and more funding to cover labor provisions in the agreement, which are far more far-reaching than were under NAFTA. So I do think that both NAFTA and the high incarceration rate that Sherry mentioned that resulted from Clinton policies were determining factors in some of the traditional voters that were lost in the aftermath.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks both of you, actually. So the next question is, it's more on the situation in the recent months. So did the working class and also the unions have something to say on the pandemic? How did they position themselves to the challenges that came with the pandemic? And what is actually the situation of the working class? I mean, we all read that a lot of jobs were lost at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of them have been recovered in the recent months. It's slowing down a little bit. I think there was a recent report just a couple of days ago. So what is your thoughts on that?
Well, if I may start, I think here it's also important to look at the differences, at the structural differences between Germany and the US. While Germany has a very strong system of social security and labor protections, this is much less so in the US. And this was very painfully felt for many during the pandemic and is still the case. So for example, in the US, you don't have necessarily a right to paid sick leave, which is a big problem in the US. It's much easier to release workers, and all the protections, for example, for paid sick leave or for social protection had to be passed as temporary measures by Congress. And they covered part of the workforce and others that were unemployed, but some of these measures have already expired, and all of them will expire by the end of the year, and it is still undetermined whether Congress will find a way to continue these measures. So a big difference is whereas Kurzarbeit, short-term working allowance in Germany was already there pre-pandemic. Measures like that had to be agreed upon between the two parties for a certain amount of time, but no structural changes were implemented, nothing that would last beyond the pandemic. And of course, the unions were big advocates in this and demanded more action. And one actor that was actually very much missing in action was the part of the Department of Labor where the protection of workers in their workplace is being decided. So the AFL-CIO, the Federation of Unions here in the US, actually sued OSHA, which is the authority under the roof of the Labor Department, to provide an emergency standard protecting workers in their workplace in the pandemic. But they lost this lawsuit, and so far there is still no guidelines, no binding guidelines for companies to provide certain protective standards for their workers.
So let me add one other thing about unions during the pandemic, which is that some of the ways that unionization has changed, so the growth of unions among professional workers, for example, has been fairly visible in the pandemic, as we've seen, for example, nurses at a number of hospital groups protesting to get more PPE, more of the personal protective equipment that will help keep them safe during the pandemic, as well as protesting over staffing and that kind of thing. We had here in Washington, D.C. just recently, a pretty effective series of moves by the teachers union, pushing back on the city's effort to get kids back in schools. One of the things that's happened around the country is teachers organizing to say, yes, it might be safe for the kids, but what about us? And really trying to fight for that. And we've even seen some slight uptick in unionizing efforts in places like Amazon and Walmart and other, mail order retail has become even more important than it was before. And we've seen a fair amount of organizing in those places during the pandemic, partially pushing back on safety in the workplace and partially recognizing just how important they are right now. So I'm not investing a ton of hope in that, but I think that the economic changes that have gone on are helping people understand the value of standing together to demand what they need and to demand protections and better treatment in the workplace.
Excellent. Actually, you almost answered the question that reached us just right now, because it was on the decline of people among unions. So I think you mentioned around 10% or so of the workforce are organized in unions right now. So do both of you think that there is any chance to reverse that trend? And it's a good sign that in Amazon people are organizing again, I think, even though it's only a very small sign.
So I think there are some small pieces of evidence of that. Things like the Amazon organizing, some of the work going on around the country under the heading of bargaining for the common good, where teachers, for example, worked incredibly well with people in communities to stand up to get better funding for schools. So I think there are some moves in that direction. We have a lot to overcome, and it's worth noting that some of the neoliberal policies that go back to at least the Clinton administration also include a lot of ways that the laws to protect union organizing have been undermined. So there's a lot that needs to change for that really to shift. Anja, you may have a better perspective on that, though.
Well, what I'd like to add, and what is maybe important to understand in the German context, is that unions have very different rights here in the US, and that organizing is structured differently. So in the US, there is no social partnership model, and works councils are mostly unknown. Unions have to organize each facility individually, and a vote has to be held among the workforce to determine whether a union will be allowed to represent workers in this workplace. And you've seen a pattern, especially in the southern states in the US, where union organizing is heavily targeted, where politicians, for example, governors or senators from these states will intervene in elections and tell people do not vote to be represented by the union because this will endanger your job or your wage will go down or something like this. So there is political intervention, which is mostly unknown in European countries and would mostly be illegal. So, and this has to be kept in the back of your mind when you look at union organizing in the US. I do think that there is some hope, as Sherry mentioned, during the pandemic, there has been a lot of union activity. And I think people have realized how important unions are as representatives of the workforce, because over the last decades, with the decline of the role in unions, you have seen an extreme imbalance and a growing imbalance between management, which is represented by very professional legal teams, and a declining voice of the workforce, which is shown in decreasing working conditions and labor rights, and also in declining real wages for workers.
Thanks. I'm trying to tie two questions together, but because we're almost at the end of our 60 minutes, that was our goal at least for the beginning, when we started our talk tonight. And I have to confess, one of the questions is my question, but it fits very well with the question that the audience member asked. And I'd like to give you a quote from the New York Times just a couple of days ago, where David Shor, a data scientist of the Democratic campaigns, said, "The big picture problem is that the Democratic Party is increasingly reflecting the cultural values and political preferences of educated white people. Culturally, working class non-white people have more in common with working class white people than with educated white people." So, I mean, I was kind of shocked by, I really have to say that I was kind of shocked that somebody would actually suppose that the living experience or life experiences of somebody who's, for example, from an African-American working class background is more comparable to a white working class background. I mean, this is a very, how should I say that? This is a challenging position, I guess. And the question that an audience member asked in connection to that was, how can the Democratic Party then regain the trust of working class voters? What are your opinions on these issues?
So these are tough questions. I think it's generally true that the Democratic Party has increasingly become the party of a set of positions that are associated with those with education and a fair amount of status, including the placing of value on education itself, and the idea that the answer to all of our problems is education itself. Hence the emphasis on the idea of forgiving college loans or making college tuition at least much lower cost, if not free. All of this reflects an assumption that the right way to be is to be like the educated middle class and professional class of any race, by the way, because part of what's also associated with that elite is a set of progressive ideas about race and inclusion and equity. So I wouldn't necessarily divide it along racial lines, even though that elite group tends more likely to be white. There are many ways structurally in which the conditions of working class people of color and working class whites are much more similar, but they are divided on kind of ideological lines in terms of how much they think things like race matter. So that I don't think we can make a dividing line in the working class or in the Democratic Party, for that matter, neatly. I think we have to understand that these things, that this, if you take these three people and put them over here, they're going to agree. And you take two of those people and put them with this other person over here, they're going to agree. I think as much as I would say the working class is complicated, I think the Democratic Party is complicated too. I am more and more convinced that what we're going to have to do eventually is have more party options. And it's very hard to get to that within the American system, but without it, we just end up divided in so very many ways.
Anja, do you want to add to that, or?
Sure, maybe just a brief note. I think for Democrats, 2020 was really an eye-opening experience because they were anticipating also prospectively that with the changing demographic, meaning that whites will go down in numbers and Latinos and other minority groups will gain in their share in population. So I think Democrats were anticipating that their share in voters will increase by this demographic change. And the fact, which Sherry mentioned previously, that Trump was actually able to gain votes among Black voters, among Latino voters, and then among Asian Americans was really an awakening. But I think one divide that we haven't looked at in the session is the urban-rural divide, which has become even more apparent in this election, that you find Democrats increasingly flocking to urban areas and the rural vote becoming more and more Republican. So I think this is something that the Democratic Party needs to look at, how to mobilize voters in rural areas and how to become more appealing to voters there.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for 3 more questions, and let's hear it from one from our Zoom audience. What are your thoughts on things like cancel culture and identity politics and how these movements have affected working class politics? Of course, this is a topic that is very popular to a certain degree, that the Democrats have exchanged economic issues with identity politics, and that they're now suffering from that. So what is your opinion on that?
Well, I would start by making a distinction between cancel culture and identity politics. Cancel culture is the 2020 way of talking about what we used to call political correctness. And the sense that there's been a stronger pushback. This goes back at least to the Me Too movement from a couple of years ago, if not further. I'll just say that my take on that is that that's actually much more limited than the popular discourse makes it sound. So I'm going to set that aside. I think it's not as big an issue, other than the fact that one of the cultural things that has drawn a lot of people to Donald Trump in ways that baffle a lot of those educated elites who make up the core of the Democratic Party of any race, is that people like his willingness to say openly things that are racist, that are sexist, that are anti-immigrant, that reflect what a lot of people think of as the darkest, meanest, most I don't know what term, Hillary Clinton called it deplorable, that side of American culture. And for a lot of people, that reflects a resistance to a sense that there is a cultural right and wrong, and if they don't line up properly, they're in trouble. And that causes a lot of resistance among a lot of people. Identity politics is a somewhat different matter. Because I don't think we can say broadly that identity politics has hurt the Democratic Party. Even if we're seeing some declines in the number of voters of color, if a few more of them went over to Donald Trump, I think it's more, I think we continue to have issues of identity bring people into the Democratic Party because they feel recognized there. We also often talk about identity politics as if we could assign people each to one neat category. So I, as an individual, would have to be either white, female, educated, upper middle class, Jewish, urban. I could only have one of those. You know what? People don't work that way. We, all of us, have multiple identities. And yet we see a lot of organizing that takes on issues that are based in identity. A lot of work among white evangelicals, for example, that have supported Donald Trump for fairly narrow reasons in many ways. All of the Black Lives Matter protests that this year extended far beyond African-American communities to involve huge numbers of white people, especially in urban areas. So an issue around identity, about Blackness, yes. Limited to Black people, caring only about Black people, no, that's not how it works. So I actually think identity politics and cancel culture are both oversimplifications of the complications of American culture in the contemporary era.
Thanks. So to the two last questions now. For ANJA, I mean, we are interested in how the German embassy talks to people from, I don't know, the Trump administration or even the transition team or from the Democratic Party, and how, I mean, are there talks going on about how are you doing that with Social Security measures? How is your health insurance working? How satisfied are people with what we are doing in Germany? And what can we learn from that? Is there something like, or of course the other way around as well? I mean, there are a lot of things that we can actually learn from the United States. So are there these kind of talks in relation to labor, to Social Security and so on going on? Or is it mostly a one-way street, or how does it work?
Well, on this issue, I think the Trump administration was really different from previous administrations, because when you look at my portfolio, for example, labor and social policy or health policy, we had few common denominators. We have a social partnership model in Germany. For us, it's normal that we have works councils, that we have strong unions, and there's very little debate within the democratic spectrum that this should be any different, or we have a political consensus that there should be universal health coverage and that everybody should have health insurance, that there should be a social protection floor for those who are economically suffering. And so under the Trump administration, there was, of course, on these issues, a lot of disagreement. So of course, we had these discussions, but it was less, as in past administrations, a discussion about best practices and where can we learn from each other's models. Where we did have this in my portfolio was on apprenticeship. President Trump had a very strong interest in learning from the German apprenticeship model and building a similar structure in the US. But of course, the apprenticeship system here in the US is very different from what we're doing in Germany. But there, on the apprenticeship issue, we did have very regular dialogues, including German companies and experts from Germany to deliver the expertise. This being said, of course, during the entire administration, we did have best practice dialogues with unions. For example, Rainer Hoffmann, the president of the DGB, came to the US to advise the AFL-CIO Commission on the future of work, on the work that his commission had done in Germany. So while on some issues government dialogue wasn't as intensive as it used to be on the civil society side, and there was always an extremely strong dialogue on best practices and where we can see mutual learning opportunities.
Thank you. And one last question. We talked a lot about the presidential elections and especially the Democratic Party, of course, in this talk. But of course, the working class does not only vote for the president, they also vote for people who then go to the House of Representatives or are in the Senate. And this is something that is often left out in the German discussion, basically altogether. And are there differences in ways that people who elect Donald Trump maybe vote for a Democratic candidate in their district, or is the party affiliation very strong? So I'm interested in that.
So I'll just say that in this election in particular, what we know about that has been really suggests some changes. You know, for generations, people in the United States voted one-party ticket. You know, John Russo, who's a little bit older than I am, reminds me about when he was a child, his mother going into the voting booth in Michigan. And in Michigan at that point, you could push one button and you would vote for all of the Democratic candidates. And his mother told him, this is how you vote. You go in, you push the Democratic button and you're done. Clearly in this year's election, it didn't happen that way. There were districts that went for Biden and then elected a Republican representative to the US Congress. There were states that went for Trump, but added to Democrats in state legislatures. I think one of the big surprises of this election, especially after 2018, you'll recall that in 2018, we had a pretty significant increase in the number of Democrats in the US House of Representatives. That number has actually gone down. The split between the two parties is now closer. And as Anja mentioned, in Georgia, we're down to 2 senators. Who controls the US Senate is going to come down to those 2 seats in Georgia. And what that suggests is that we've seen much more division and people really looking at candidate by candidate. I'm not sure yet exactly what that means and how it all fell out. I know that in the end, what it means is that getting things done is going to be challenging. If Democrats don't win those 2 seats in Georgia, Joe Biden can talk a really good game, but what he's actually going to be able to get done will be pretty limited.
Well, that's a sadder note for for ending our discussion that I was hoping for. But anyways, we'll see what's going to happen. And I'd like to thank both of you for this very inspiring talk. It was very informative, and I think we all enjoyed it a lot. So thanks again, Sherry Lincoln and Anja WEHLER-SCHÖCK, for taking part in this talk tonight. And I'd like to thank you in the audience for taking time to discuss these things with us. And we hope you had a great time and you learned something and take something home with you. Of course, I'm realizing that most of you probably or hopefully are at home during the pandemic. But I'd like to say thanks again to the DGB München and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, the BayernForum from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung who supported this talk tonight. And I'd like to refer you to our website and of course also to our partners' websites to look for similar programs on these issues, on the American elections, on working class and questions associated with that. Of course, not only when it comes to the US, but also to our societies, which is of course as important. And again, thank you everyone. Have a really great night and see you soon in other formats. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.